Her father said she needs a good man, not a rich one. The old rancher's voice was calm, steady, and without a trace of bitterness as he stood on the weathered porch of his small ranch house. His faded hat shaded eyes that had seen droughts, hard winters, and years of honest labor beneath the unforgiving western sun. Across from him stood a quiet cowboy dressed in dusty clothes, worn leather boots, and a simple brown hat. There was nothing about the stranger that suggested wealth. His horse carried no fancy saddle. His clothes bore patches from travel. He looked like any hardworking cowboy who had spent countless days driving cattle across endless prairie. The rancher folded his weathered arms before adding gently, "If you're here to ask for my daughter's hand, understand this first. Gold doesn't keep a family together, character does." The cowboy simply smiled. "My name is Shaun," he answered respectfully, and I couldn't agree more. Neither the old man nor anyone else on the ranch knew they were speaking to one of the wealthiest cattle owners in the territory. Shaun, 33 years old, owned thousands of acres several counties away. His cattle filled sprawling grasslands, and respected businessmen often sought his advice before making major investments. Yet none of that mattered to him today. He had left behind every sign of success because he wanted one thing that money could never buy: a chance to be judged by the kind of man he truly was. The old rancher introduced himself as Thomas Hale and slowly studied the visitor once more. Years of experience had taught him to read people before trusting them. Some men carried arrogance beneath polished boots. Others hid greed behind polite smiles. Shaun carried neither. His posture was humble, his voice measured, and his eyes met Thomas's with quiet honesty. Before either man could speak again, the front door creaked open. A woman stepped outside carrying a wooden bucket filled with fresh water. She paused the moment she noticed the unfamiliar cowboy. Nelsie Hale was 28 years old, and anyone meeting her for the first time quickly realized she belonged on a ranch every bit as much as any man. Strong from years of honest work, she moved with confidence born from experience rather than pride. Long chestnut hair rested in a practical braid beneath her hat. Her sleeves were rolled above sun-browned forearms marked by hard work instead of jewelry. Intelligent gray-blue eyes observed everything before she spoke. Thomas smiled faintly. "Nelsie," he said, "this young man says he'd like permission to court you." She looked from her father to Shaun, clearly surprised. "You rode all this way just to ask permission first?" Shaun nodded. "I believe respect should arrive before romance." For the first time, a small smile appeared on Nelsie's face. It disappeared almost as quickly. "You barely know me." "I know enough to want the chance," Shaun replied. Thomas cleared his throat. "I've told him the same thing I've told every man who's come here." Nelsie already knew the words before he repeated them. "She needs a good man, not a rich one." Shaun lowered his head respectfully. "That's exactly why I'm standing here." Thomas expected disappointment. Instead, he saw gratitude. It puzzled him. Most men tried to impress fathers with promises of bigger homes, larger herds, or comfortable futures. Shaun had offered none of those things. He hadn't mentioned money once. Thomas finally sighed. "I won't promise you anything. I wouldn't ask you to. You may stay here for several weeks if you're willing to work beside us. No special treatment, no shortcuts. At the end of that time, my daughter will decide for herself." Shaun extended his hand. "That's more than fair." The two men shook hands firmly. Nelsie watched the exchange in thoughtful silence. She had seen plenty of charming men before. Some admired her appearance. Others secretly wanted the ranch, small as it was. None had ever arrived asking first for her father's blessing without boasting about themselves. Still, actions mattered more than words. She intended to discover exactly what kind of man Shaun really was. That evening, Thomas pointed toward the old hay barn. "It's dry enough to sleep there." Shaun smiled. "I've slept in worse." No complaint escaped his lips. After feeding his horse, he helped carry water buckets without being asked. When a loose gate sagged near the corral, he quietly repaired it before supper. During dinner, he thanked Nelsie for the simple meal as though it had been served in the finest hotel. Later, while the stars brightened above the prairie, Thomas noticed something unusual. Shaun carefully brushed down every ranch horse before tending to his own. "Those aren't your horses," Thomas observed. Shaun shrugged lightly. "They worked just as hard today." The old rancher said nothing, though the gesture remained in his thoughts. Before sunrise the following morning, Nelsie stepped outside expecting to begin her daily chores first. Instead, she stopped in surprise. Smoke already drifted from the cookfire. Fresh water had been drawn from the well, the chickens had been fed, even the stubborn mule had already been harnessed for the day's work. Shaun stood repairing a cracked fence post with calm concentration. "You've been awake long?" Nelsie asked. "A little while." "You didn't have to do all this." "I know. Then why did you?" He smiled without looking up. "Because work waiting to be done doesn't care whose name is on the land." His answer lingered in her thoughts throughout the morning. As they rode together checking distant fencing, she noticed he never tried to impress her with exaggerated stories. Instead, he listened whenever she explained how she managed grazing rotations or predicted weather from cloud formations. Rather than dismissing her knowledge because she was a woman, he treated her experience with genuine respect. That alone set him apart from nearly every cowboy she had ever met. By afternoon, they had repaired broken rails, guided wandering calves home, and hauled supplies across rough country. Shaun never once complained. He simply worked. Thomas watched quietly from a distance. He had expected the stranger's determination to fade before noon. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger with every task. As the western sky turned golden and long shadows stretched across the fields, the old rancher realized something unexpected. For the first time in years, the ranch felt lighter. Not because another pair of hands made the labor easier, but because those hands worked without expecting praise, reward, or recognition. Inside the old hay barn that evening, Shaun rolled out his blanket onto the rough wooden floor. Few people would have believed that the richest cowboy for miles around rested contentedly beneath a leaking roof with nothing but a saddle for a pillow. Yet as distant coyotes called beneath a sky filled with countless stars, Shaun closed his eyes wearing the quiet smile of a man who believed he had finally found a place where hearts were valued more than fortunes, and he hoped with patience and honest work he might one day earn the trust of the woman who had already begun to admire the man behind the dust. The days that followed settled into a comfortable rhythm, and before long, it became difficult for anyone at the Hale Ranch to remember what life had been like before Shaun arrived. He never tried to make himself the center of attention. Instead, he quietly slipped into every chore as though he had belonged there for years. If a fence needed mending, he gathered the tools before anyone asked. If a calf wandered beyond the grazing fields, he saddled a horse without complaint. Every task, no matter how ordinary, received the same careful attention. Thomas watched all of it without saying much. Experience had taught him that real character revealed itself in ordinary moments, not grand speeches. A hardworking man could pretend for a day or two, but weeks of dusty labor usually exposed pride, impatience, or selfishness. Shaun revealed none of those qualities. One afternoon, while repairing an old windmill, Thomas deliberately handed Shaun the most difficult part of the job. The heavy wooden beam had to be lifted into place with careful balance. Shaun accepted the task without hesitation, though it left his shoulders aching by sunset. "You could have asked me to help sooner," Thomas remarked afterward. Shaun smiled. "I wanted to make sure I truly needed it first." The answer lingered in the old rancher's mind. Meanwhile, Nelsie found herself noticing the little things. Shaun always removed his hat before entering the house. He thanked her for every meal, no matter how simple. When she spoke about ranch accounts or breeding stock, he listened carefully instead of pretending to know better. Many men seemed uncomfortable with a capable woman, but Shaun admired her knowledge openly. One evening they rode together to inspect cattle grazing near a winding creek several miles from the ranch. The setting sun painted the prairie with shades of gold while tall grass swayed gently in the evening breeze. "You've worked ranches before," Nelsie observed. "A few. You make difficult jobs look easy. I've had good teachers." She laughed softly. "You answer almost every question without bragging. My father once told me that if your work speaks clearly enough, your mouth doesn't have to." The words stayed with her long after they returned home. A few days later, an elderly ranch hand named Ben arrived from a neighboring property, limping badly after twisting his ankle while loading supplies. The injury kept him from earning wages, and everyone knew medical care was expensive. Thomas quietly worried for the old man. The following morning, the local doctor unexpectedly visited Ben's cabin with medicine and fresh bandages. Ben insisted he had no money to pay. "The bill's already been settled," the doctor replied. "By who?" The doctor simply smiled. "A friend who asked me not to say." Neither Ben nor Thomas discovered the truth. Only Nelsie happened to see Shaun returning from town much later than expected that afternoon. His saddlebag, which had been noticeably heavier before sunrise, now hung almost empty. She wondered if there was a connection, but she respected his silence and never asked. As the weeks passed, neighboring ranchers began stopping by the Hale property more often. They spoke warmly of the helpful stranger who repaired broken wagon wheels, lifted fallen fence posts, and offered an extra pair of hands without expecting payment. One widow quietly mentioned that Shaun had spent nearly an entire afternoon stacking firewood for her before disappearing without waiting for thanks. Another rancher laughed while recalling how Shaun had spent hours calming a frightened horse that no one else could approach. Thomas listened carefully. The stories all sounded remarkably alike. Nobody described dramatic heroics. They simply described kindness. Late one afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the western horizon. Within hours, fierce winds swept across the prairie, carrying sheets of rain that rattled rooftops and bent young trees. The storm wasn't violent enough to threaten lives, but it damaged fences, scattered livestock, and collapsed part of an old equipment shed. The following morning revealed the full extent of the destruction. Broken rails stretched across muddy fields. Several frightened calves had wandered away. Neighbors stood staring at the damage, unsure where to begin. Before anyone started arguing over priorities, Shaun quietly stepped forward. "We'll find the calves first," he said calmly. "Then we'll repair the fences nearest the open grazing land. After that, we'll help whichever family has the worst damage." Nobody questioned him, not because he raised his voice, because he spoke with quiet confidence. Throughout the day, he organized groups, assigned simple tasks, and worked beside everyone else instead of giving orders from horseback. When someone grew tired, Shaun picked up the heavier load himself. By sunset, wandering cattle had been returned safely, broken fences stood straight again, and the widow's damaged shed had been repaired before Shaun even considered fixing the Hale property. Thomas watched him wipe sweat from his brow before handing his water canteen to another exhausted rancher. "You've hardly stopped working," Thomas observed. "We're almost finished. You could rest. So could everyone else." That evening, several neighboring families gathered around a campfire to share supper after the long day. The mood was lighter than anyone expected after such exhausting work. As sparks drifted upward into the night sky, conversation turned toward success. One rancher joked that every man dreamed of owning twice as much land. Another wished for larger herds. Someone asked Shaun what he considered true wealth. He looked thoughtfully into the fire before answering. "A man's wealth isn't counted by cattle," he said quietly. "It's counted by the people who feel safer because he came." Silence settled over the gathering. The simple sentence carried more weight than any boast about money ever could. Thomas slowly nodded. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, he found Nelsie standing beside the corral, watching horses graze beneath the moonlight. "I've been thinking," he admitted. She smiled. "About Shaun," Thomas chuckled softly. "I've spent weeks trying to find something false about that young man. And I haven't found it." Nelsie looked toward the quiet barn where Shaun was finishing the evening chores. "I don't think he knows how to pretend." Thomas rested both hands on the fence rail. "When he first rode in, I believed he was just another cowboy looking for a wife." "What do you believe now?" The old rancher smiled gently. "I believe if that young man never earned another dollar, he'd still die richer than most men." Nelsie lowered her eyes, unable to hide the warmth spreading across her face. Somewhere between repairing fences, sharing quiet rides across open prairie, and watching Shaun choose kindness over comfort every single day, her heart had quietly made its decision. She had begun looking for him each morning before realizing she was doing it. She found herself smiling whenever he smiled. Most surprising of all, she no longer imagined life on the ranch without him. Inside the old barn, unaware of the conversation outside, Shaun carefully unfolded a small leather pouch he had carried for years. Hidden inside was a silver pocket watch engraved with his family's name, one of the few possessions connecting him to the life he had deliberately concealed. He stared at it for a long moment before closing the pouch again. Soon, he knew, the truth about who he really was could no longer remain hidden. The morning after Shaun tucked the engraved pocket watch back into its leather pouch began like every other day at the Hale Ranch. Dawn spilled across the prairie, painting the endless grasslands with soft gold. Nelsie gathered feed for the chickens while Thomas checked the horses. Shaun repaired a loose gate beside the corral, his sleeves rolled to his elbows and his boots already covered in dust before breakfast. Nothing about the peaceful morning suggested that everything was about to change. Shortly before noon, the distant sound of approaching horses drifted across the valley. Thomas shaded his eyes and counted 5 riders approaching in an orderly line. "They don't look like cattle buyers," he muttered. As the riders reached the ranch, they dismounted almost at once. Their clothes were well tailored, their horses were among the finest Thomas had ever seen, and each man carried himself with quiet confidence rather than arrogance. The oldest stepped forward. "There you are, Mr. Calloway." Thomas blinked. "Mr. Calloway?" The visitor removed his hat respectfully. "We've been searching 2 counties for you. The railroad representatives have arrived earlier than expected, and the contracts need your signature." For a brief moment, complete silence settled over the ranch. Nelsie's eyes slowly turned toward Shaun. Thomas looked equally confused. Shaun let out a quiet breath, knowing the moment he had hoped to postpone had finally arrived. "I suppose I owe everyone an explanation," he said gently. The visitors looked from one face to another before realizing nobody on the ranch knew who Shaun truly was. One of them smiled with surprise. "You mean they don't know you're the owner of Calloway Ridge?" Thomas frowned. "Owner?" The man nodded. "One of the largest cattle ranches in the territory." Another added, "Thousands of acres, more cattle than most counties combined." Thomas stared at Shaun as though meeting him for the first time. "You?" Shaun lowered his eyes. "Yes, you've been wealthy this entire time?" "I have." Nelsie remained silent, searching his face instead of reacting to the astonishing news. Thomas finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell us?" Shaun answered honestly. "Because I wanted you to know me before you knew my bank accounts, my land, or my cattle." The riders quietly stepped back, sensing the conversation belonged to the family rather than themselves. Thomas removed his hat and rubbed a weathered hand across his forehead. "I judged you by your clothes." "You judged me by my actions," Shaun corrected kindly. "I believed you were poor. You believed I could still become a good husband." The old rancher's shoulders slowly relaxed. Shaun continued. "The greatest compliment you've ever given me wasn't permission to stay here." Thomas looked puzzled. "It was the day you said your daughter needed a good man instead of a rich one." Emotion filled the old man's tired eyes. "I never imagined." "I know, you could have corrected me. I could have. Why didn't you?" Shaun smiled gently. "Because for the first time in many years, someone valued character before wealth." His words settled deeply into the silence. The visitors soon excused themselves, promising to return in 2 days after Shaun had spoken with the family. Once they rode away, only the gentle wind crossed the open prairie. Thomas slowly sat on the porch steps. "I owe you an apology." "There is nothing to apologize for." "There certainly is." The old rancher looked toward the fields stretching beyond the house. "I spent years worrying that wealthy men would see my daughter as something they could purchase with gifts." Shaun quietly listened. "I never wanted money to decide her future." "It didn't." Thomas looked up. "It truly didn't." Shaun sat beside him. "My father built our ranch from almost nothing." Thomas nodded. "I've heard stories about Calloway Ridge. He always told me that wealth attracts admiration, but character earns trust." The old rancher smiled sadly. "Your father was a wise man. He also warned me that one day I'd wonder whether people loved me or simply loved what I owned." Thomas understood immediately. "So you left all of it behind." "I wanted one chance to meet someone honestly." Nelsie finally stepped forward. She had remained quiet throughout the conversation because her heart had already answered every question before her mind caught up. She looked directly into Shaun's eyes. "When you repaired our fences?" "Yes." "Were you pretending?" "No." "When you helped Ben?" "No." "When you thanked me for every meal?" "I meant every word." "When you slept in the barn?" "I slept better there than I have in many expensive bedrooms." A smile slowly appeared across her face. "Then nothing important has changed." Relief softened Shaun's expression. "The only difference," she continued, "is that now I understand why your hands knew every part of ranch life so well." He laughed quietly. "I've spent most of my life working beside cowboys." "I can believe that." Thomas watched them with growing happiness. For weeks he had hoped his daughter might find someone worthy of her heart. Now he realized she already had. 2 evenings later, after finishing the day's work together, Shaun asked Nelsie if she would walk with him. They followed a familiar trail leading toward the old oak tree where they often rested after checking distant pasture land. The setting sun filled the sky with warm shades of amber and crimson. Birdsong drifted through the gentle breeze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Shaun stopped beneath the broad branches of the oak. "I came here hoping to earn your father's trust." Nelsie smiled softly. "You did. I hope to earn yours even more. You did that, too." He reached into his jacket and carefully removed a small wooden box. It was simple, polished smooth by years of careful keeping. Inside rested a graceful silver ring set with a modest blue stone. "It belonged to my mother," Shaun said quietly. "She wore it every day until she passed away." Nelsie's eyes filled with tears. "I've carried it with me ever since." He knelt on one knee. "Nelsie Hale." His voice remained calm despite the emotion in his eyes. "You've shown me that kindness still exists, that honesty still matters, and that love can grow from shared work instead of grand promises." He gently held out the ring. "Will you marry me?" For several seconds she simply looked at him, not at the ring, not at the family name it represented, only at the man who had spent weeks repairing fences, feeding animals before sunrise, sleeping in a barn without complaint, and choosing humility every single day. Then she smiled through happy tears. "I fell in love with you long before I learned you were wealthy." She slipped the ring onto her finger. "So yes." Shaun stood, and they embraced beneath the old oak while the evening breeze carried away every remaining doubt. When they returned to the ranch, Thomas was waiting on the porch. He noticed the ring immediately. Without saying a word, he walked down the steps and wrapped both of them in a warm embrace. "I couldn't have asked for a better son." "You already did," Shaun replied with a smile. "You asked for a good man." Preparations for the wedding remained simple, just as Nelsie wanted. Neighbors gathered with homemade food, music, and laughter. No extravagant decorations covered the ranch. Instead, every guest brought something meaningful: fresh flowers, handmade quilts, carved wooden gifts, or favorite family recipes. The celebration reflected the same values that had brought Shaun and Nelsie together: community, gratitude, and honest affection. After the wedding, Shaun surprised Thomas with another promise. "I'm not taking Nelsie away from this ranch." Thomas looked confused. "You aren't?" "This place is part of her heart." He smiled toward the familiar fields. "We'll restore every fence, repair every building, and keep both ranches working together." True to his word, Shaun invested time, knowledge, and resources into strengthening the Hale Ranch without changing its spirit. Thomas remained its respected leader, while Nelsie helped oversee both properties with remarkable skill. Workers from each ranch treated one another like extended family instead of competitors, and neighboring communities benefited from Shaun's quiet generosity, just as they always had. Years later, laughter echoed across the prairie as children raced between the two neighboring ranches, chasing puppies through tall grass beneath wide western skies. Thomas sat peacefully on his porch, watching his grandchildren play while Shaun and Nelsie worked side by side exactly as they always had. The old rancher smiled to himself. Once, he had believed his greatest responsibility was protecting his daughter from men who valued wealth above character. Instead, life had sent her a man whose greatest treasure had never been measured in cattle, land, or gold. It had always been measured by humility, compassion, integrity, and the quiet willingness to serve others before himself. Looking across the peaceful ranches glowing beneath another western sunset, Thomas whispered with grateful certainty, "I prayed for a good husband for my daughter. The Lord simply chose to send one whose richest possession was his heart, and everything else was only a blessing that followed."